Boaters and sailors of Reddit, what is the scariest or most unexplainable thing you've experienced at sea? Sailing through the Bahamas, there are moments when the water can feel eerily calm, even with a steady 10 to 15 knot wind. One night, I was at the helm alone, and we drifted through a patch of phosphorescent plankton. The ocean shimmered so brightly it was impossible to tell where the sky ended and the water began. It felt like I was sailing through the stars themselves. Another time, a guy in Florida gave the boat I was on some coordinates somewhere between the Turks and Caicos banks and Hispaniola. He insisted there was something mind-blowing out there, but wouldn't tell the captain what it was. He wanted it to be a surprise. When we reached the spot, after some motoring, we found a constant bubbling in the water. At first, we had no idea what it was, until the captain scooped a bucket from the bubbling water and drank from it. It turned out to be a pillar of fresh water, gushing straight from a vent in the ocean floor. Completely surreal. My father twice sailed a 42-foot boat from Marion, Massachusetts, all the way to Bermuda. Of everything he described about those races, what stayed with him most wasn't the wind or the waves, it was the darkness. Out on the open ocean, on a cloudy, moonless night, the blackness was complete. At one point they had to reset a breaker and shut off the running lights. With the boat swallowed in darkness, he said he genuinely couldn't tell whether his eyes were open or closed. There was no horizon, no shadow, no faint outline of sea or sky, just nothing. And yet, he also told me about the opposite experience. On clear nights, far from any shore or city glow, the sky blazed with stars. Without light pollution, the heavens seemed impossibly crowded and close, every constellation sharp and alive. It was only then, he said, that he truly understood how ancient sailors could navigate by the stars alone. My father and I once sailed from Key West to Tampa, a slow, unhurried trip that takes about a week if you let the wind decide the schedule. One night, close to midnight, we spotted running lights ahead of us. One red, one green, steady in the dark. The haze was thick and the moon nowhere to be found, so the lights were all we could see. No hull, no wake, just those 2 points floating in the black. We assumed it was another boat on the same heading and fell in behind it, keeping a respectful distance. For 3 hours we followed those lights. Then it happened. A sound rolled across the water. It was deep and resonant, like an enormous wooden door groaning open, but amplified, dragged out, and impossibly loud. It vibrated in my chest. And just like that, the lights vanished. Gone. About an hour later, the haze thinned as dawn approached. By sunrise, the sky had cleared enough for us to see in every direction. There was nothing out there. No boat. No ship on the horizon. Just open ocean stretching endlessly under the morning light. On a lighter note, a few days later around 4 in the morning, my dad was at the helm while I dozed on the deck. I woke to him shouting in pure panic. For a split second, I thought we were about to collide with something. Turns out he'd started nodding off, and a flying fish launched itself straight into his face. It hit him squarely and landed on deck, still flopping wildly while he tried to figure out what had just attacked him. The ocean can be eerie. It can also have a sense of humor. I sailed around the world from the time I was 23 to 25 on a 43-foot boat. Of everything that happened in those 2 years, one night leaving Singapore still stands out as the most unsettling. We departed in the middle of the night, threading our way through the busy shipping lanes. It felt like a high-stakes game of Frogger, dodging massive freighters in the dark, but otherwise our course was simple enough. Around 3 a.m., I was alone at the helm while the rest of the crew slept below. The radar was set to alarm if anything came within a quarter mile. Suddenly, it beeped. I scanned the horizon. Nothing obvious. No lights, no silhouettes, just darkness. I switched on the autopilot and went below to check the radar screen more closely. Normally, other vessels appeared as small blobs. This was different. The screen showed a long, solid line stretching across it, directly ahead of us. And it was closing fast. My pulse spiked. I hurried back on deck, staring into the night as my eyes adjusted. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, a shape began to form. Less than 100 yards ahead stood a wall, 20 feet high, unlit, sheer, and solid. Right in the middle of what we thought was open water. As we drifted closer, I could hear waves slapping against it. This was before chart plotters were common. We were navigating by paper charts. Ours were only 2 years old. I was confused, disoriented, and genuinely terrified. I shouted for all hands on deck. We dropped sails, fired up the engine, and brought the boat to a halt. Inch by inch, we maneuvered through what gradually became clear, a massive construction zone. In the short time since our charts had been printed, Singapore had expanded through an enormous land reclamation project. What our maps showed as open sea had become brand new coastline. Even after we cleared the maze of barriers and found safe water, no one went back to sleep. The image of that dark wall materializing out of nowhere has stayed with me ever since, an impossible shoreline rising from the black. Out in open water, we started noticing dolphins pacing the bow, but these weren't the sleek, familiar kind you see in postcards. They had blunt, almost squared-off faces and an odd, ancient look to them. When they surfaced, they didn't just arc and disappear. They came right up to the bow and stared at us. Not curious in a playful way, more like they were studying us. In the gray light and endless ocean backdrop, they looked completely alien, like something that had wandered in from another planet. For a while we just stood there, half fascinated, half unsettled, watching them watch us. Later, after a bit of research, we discovered they were very much earthly residents, just a species we'd never encountered before. Still didn't stop them from looking extraterrestrial. I served in the Navy on ballistic missile submarines, and one winter we were running drills off the coast of Alaska, conditions straight out of Deadliest Catch. The seas were monstrous. I was on my way to take the helm when we began coming up to periscope depth for a drill. As we rose, you could start to feel the ocean grab hold of the boat. The motion built fast. I had to brace myself against the bulkheads just to move down the passageway. At times I had to stop entirely unless I wanted to slide the length of the corridor. Gear was coming loose. The deck pitched so violently there were moments my boots weren't even touching it. I remember thinking, we must already be surfaced. Then someone announced we were approaching periscope depth, in sea state 9+, with hurricane-force winds overhead. I rushed to relieve the watch and strapped into the seat. That's when it became truly terrifying. We leveled off as best we could, but the submarine was rolling hard, fighting the chaos above. The only thing keeping me in place was the seat belt digging into my shoulders. Over the intercom came reports of injuries, equipment tearing free, sailors thrown against steel. The periscope was useless. We were cycling from 100 feet underwater to what felt like 50 feet in the air, the lens filled with nothing but churning foam. And then came the wave I'll tell my grandkids about someday. The submarine pitched up, steeper, until it felt nearly vertical. You could hear men shouting, not orders, but raw fear. In that instant, people were thinking about their wives, their families, whether they'd see another sunrise. We crested. The depth gauge failed because we weren't in the water anymore. Then we dropped. The impact when we slammed back down knocked the lights out. For one suspended second, everything went black. I remember the clarity of the thought, this is how I die. The lights flickered back on. Orders came fast, dive deep. Get below it all. We angled down, pushing into calmer water, and gradually the violence faded. System stabilized. Breathing slowed. And that's the story of how I briefly helped turn a billion-dollar submarine into the world's largest, angriest flying machine. I'm in the Coast Guard and have sailed the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the Pacific. The ocean has a way of showing you things you'd never believe if you hadn't seen them yourself. Some of the coolest sights? An oarfish undulating just beneath the surface like a living sea serpent. A massive sunfish drifting lazily in the swell. A dead whale that turned the water into a frenzy of circling sharks within minutes. Waterspouts twisting down from dark clouds. A leatherback turtle the size of a Volkswagen. Blue whales surfacing with that slow, ancient power. The gray whale migration rolling past in steady procession. The Milky Way glowing through night vision goggles so brightly it felt close enough to touch. And, of course, more narcotic seizures than most people could imagine. The strangest thing, though, was something I still can't explain. I had the mid-watch, midnight to 0400, and was on lookout. We were well offshore, nowhere near land. I spotted a light in the distance. It wasn't on radar. For over an hour, I watched it climb, drop, dart side to side, then hover. It didn't behave like any aircraft I'd seen. I stood there completely transfixed, half hoping it would come closer, half unsure I wanted it to. To this day, I can't tell you what it was. The scariest experience? 60-foot seas off the Oregon coast when a major storm barreled down from the Gulf of Alaska. We were getting thrown around like a toy. No one was allowed outside, but you could still go up to the bridge. I made my way up and saw waves rolling past that towered 10 feet above the bridge itself. I climbed one more level to the lookout station. As far as I could see in every direction, the ocean was nothing but towering walls of water. The storm battered the ship hard, metal bent, equipment smashed, gear ripped clean off the fantail. Standing there, watching those waves march past higher than our superstructure, I felt very, very small. When I was 10, my dad took me out by boat to snorkel near Sombrero Key Light, about 5.5 miles offshore in the Florida Keys. Even on a calm day, it's a long way out. That day wasn't calm. The water was rough and choppy, and I remember having a bad feeling before we even got there. But we suited up anyway and slipped into the ocean. Almost immediately, I was staring down into 20 to 50 feet of murky blue, sand swirling, visibility coming and going with the surge. After a few minutes, I noticed dark shapes moving below us. Maybe 10 or 15 of them, gliding in and out of view. At first, we didn't think much of it. Then we saw a grouper get torn apart right underneath us. That's when it clicked. We were surrounded by sharks. Pure panic hit me. I spun around and started swimming for the boat as fast as I could, convinced I'd suddenly become an Olympic sprinter in flippers. In my head, I was Michael Phelps. In reality, the waves were building, close to 10 feet, and every swell pushed me farther from the boat instead of closer. At some point, I realized my dad was already back on board, and I was still out there, fighting the chop alone. Every time I gained a little distance, another wave shoved me back. I swallowed mouthfuls of salt water, cried, and kept kicking. It took me about 20 exhausting minutes to reach the boat. By the time I climbed aboard, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I threw up more than once, and we headed straight back to shore. I'm still grateful the sharks never took interest in us, and that neither of us drowned. But yeah, that trip absolutely sucked. I once delivered a sailboat from Clearwater to Florida's Big Bend. If you cut straight across the Gulf, you end up about 75 miles offshore at the farthest point. That day the wind completely died, flat calm, not a ripple, so we motored the entire way. Somewhere near the midpoint, 60 or 70 miles from land in every direction, I spotted a tiny black speck on the horizon. Out there, anything that isn't blue water grabs your attention. As we got closer, the speck slowly took shape. It was a 12-foot aluminum John boat with a little 6-horsepower outboard and 3 guys sitting in it. At least 60 miles from shore. No cabin. No visible safety gear. Just a small open boat, low to the water, bobbing in the middle of the Gulf like it had taken a wrong turn somewhere near a freshwater lake. I couldn't believe it. I wouldn't trust a boat like that much farther than I could comfortably swim from land. We altered course, pulled alongside, and I asked if they were okay. One of them looked at me like I was the strange one. Of course we are. Well, all right then. We wished them luck and continued on. As we motored away, I kept glancing back at that tiny aluminum boat sitting in an ocean that stretched 60-plus miles in every direction. Some people have a very different definition of seaworthy. We were sailing overnight from Chicago to South Haven, Michigan, when a storm rolled in that I'll never forget. It hit us halfway across Lake Michigan, violent wind, relentless lightning, the kind of storm that makes the world feel very small. Apparently, the system had blown a massive flock of swallows 40 or 50 miles offshore. Disoriented and exhausted, they must have been searching desperately for somewhere, anywhere, to land. And we were the only thing out there. Our masthead light became a beacon. Bird after bird tried to reach it. In the chaos of wind and rain, they kept striking the rigging and the boat. The lightning was firing almost constantly, flashes every second or two for hours, and with each blinding burst you could see the deck. It was covered in birds. The sight would appear in stark white for a split second, then vanished back into darkness until the next strike illuminated it again. Over and over for 6 straight hours. At some point, trying to cope with how surreal it all felt, I handed my friend a solo cup and told him to start scooping. It was grim, bizarre, and strangely unforgettable. One of those moments at sea where nature doesn't just surround you, it collides with you. I recently wrapped up a stint working with a privately owned research and education group conducting shark and stingray population surveys in the Gulf of Mexico. Most days were routine: set the line, wait, tag, and release. But one day, when we hauled our gear in, we found that one of the smaller sharks we'd caught, about 2.5 feet long, had died on the line, likely from fighting the unusually strong current. It's rare, maybe once every couple of months, but it happens. Since we had the specimen, we used it as a teaching opportunity and performed a quick dissection for the students on board. Afterward, rather than waste it, we decided to use the carcass as bait. Larger predators, bull sharks, hammerheads, won't pass up an easy meal like a smaller shark. We secured it to the line with aircraft-grade steel cable rated for about 7,000 pounds of brake strength and hung it just beneath one of our large marker buoys. We rig it that way for 2 reasons. If something big hits the bait, the buoy will thrash and alert us, and keeping the bait near the surface prevents a hooked shark from diving deep, making tagging safer and easier. About 30 minutes went by. The Gulf was eerie, flat calm, no wind, no chop, just heavy heat and silence. Then, without warning, boom. A violent splash exploded beneath the buoy. The marker ball shot into the air as if launched from below, slammed back down, and the surface went still again. We rushed over and started hauling the line. There was nothing there. The shark carcass was completely gone. Not torn up. Not partially eaten. Gone. And the steel aircraft cable snapped cleanly in half. Not frayed. Not kinked. Just severed. Whatever hit that bait, about 5 miles off the Florida coast, swallowed a 2.5-foot shark and broke a 7,000-pound rated steel cable in a single bite. We never saw it. Food for thought. 5 years ago, my wife and I honeymooned in St. Lucia. One of the highlights the resort offered was a catamaran cruise around the Pitons. Scenery was gorgeous, drinks were free, the weather was perfect. The cruise stopped at a small town so we could check out a sulfur volcano and a waterfall before heading back to the resort. When it was time to board, I told my wife I really wanted to sit on the cargo net at the bow, feeling the spray and breeze to cool off. She, of course, had other ideas. We nearly got into a mini argument over it, and while we were squabbling, another couple swooped in and claimed the spots around the net. No big deal. We found a spot a little behind where I wanted to be. Halfway back, something completely unexpected happened. A game fish, honestly, I'm not sure what kind, leapt out of the water through the cargo net and landed squarely in the lap of the guy sitting where I had wanted to be. It was about 3 or 4 feet long, maybe 40 to 50 pounds, and everyone froze in shock. Then the guy started wrestling with it. Seconds later, the fish slipped back through the net, and his wife screamed. Blood was gushing from a 5-inch gash on his leg, and his feet were cut too. I was sitting right behind him, and could see the damage clearly. This wasn't a minor scrape. The crew had to pull into the next resort and get him immediate medical attention. We heard sirens wailing as we set off again, the whole scene just surreal. A few days later, at the airport, we actually saw him leaving in a wheelchair. Definitely not how anyone wants to spend a honeymoon, but thankfully, he made it through. I still think about it sometimes, imagining that my wife or I could have been the one in that spot, and I get chills just thinking about it. I was out in my 15-foot boat, about 2 miles offshore in Donegal Bay, fishing over a sandbank. Everything was calm, so I glanced back toward the shore, and about 300 meters behind me, right between my boat and the coastline, a periscope suddenly popped up out of the water. It hovered there for maybe a minute and a half before slipping back beneath the waves. Ireland doesn't have any submarines in its navy, so I have absolutely no idea who, or what, that could have been. During a night race from Santa Barbara to King Harbor, we found ourselves completely becalmed in the middle of the ocean. Pitch black water stretched in every direction, still as glass. Then, suddenly, something appeared below us, a burst of phosphorescence that erupted from the depths, expanding into a glowing disk, maybe 50 feet across. I'd seen plenty of bioluminescence before, even dolphin light tubes earlier that same race, but nothing like this sudden, explosive bloom of light. It was probably just a natural phenomenon, nothing mysterious, but seeing that luminous light bomb in the dead of night, surrounded by silence, was equal parts mesmerizing and eerie. Story 1: Jet skis. There had been some drinking going on, and naturally, someone thought it would be a great idea to ride the jet skis. I was cruising along when I noticed a houseboat with a group of women on it. In a moment of mischief, they decided to flash us. I slowed down because, well, boobs. My buddy, speeding along nearby, saw the same thing. Like a drunken idiot, he got distracted and wasn't paying attention to where he was going. By the time he looked up, it was too late. Traveling at over 50 miles per hour, he slammed straight into my jet ski. Miraculously, we made it back to shore, but both skis were badly damaged, and one was already taking on water. It was a terrifying, chaotic mess that could have ended much worse. Story 2: Boats tied together. On another occasion, a bunch of boats were tied together with people drinking and moving back and forth between them. At one point, a guy I didn't know slipped while stepping from one boat to another. He hit his head on the side and fell into the water. He sank almost instantly. Despite several people jumping in and diving as far as they could, he was gone within seconds. The screams and wailing of those on the boats, combined with the blank, motionless stare on his face as he hit the water, is something I'll never forget. I was diving Palancar Gardens in Cozumel, drifting along at about 70 feet. It was a beautiful dive, calm and colorful, when a grouper, around 3 feet long, swam into my view. Something about its movement seemed off. Then I noticed an 8-inch jagged chunk missing from its dorsal fin. It kept swimming, awkwardly, leaving a faint trail of blood behind. There were no other apex predators in sight, but for the rest of the dive, I couldn't shake the tension. I'd have been fine seeing a white-tip reef shark or even a tiger shark, but not knowing what had done this, that uncertainty kept me on edge the whole time. I was about 19, sailing in a regatta on Lake Lanier, Georgia, when the sky suddenly went pitch black and the air pressure dropped. I'd felt this before. Something wasn't right. Tornado. We were racing at the southern end of the lake, and reports came in that it had just touched down at the northern end, about 11 miles away. Chase boats started pulling people out of the water. We scrambled, sailing straight to the beach, leaving everything rigged, and dashed down into a basement for cover. Then, about a minute later, whoosh, it hit. I wouldn't call this a freak accident, more of a you can't make this up kind of story. One morning, my brother and my dad set off to a regatta in a 7 to 8 foot rubber dinghy with a 15 horsepower engine. They also brought along a friend. By the usual rule of thumb, 5 horsepower per person, it's safe to say the boat wasn't going anywhere fast. Halfway to the regatta, the engine died. Strong currents started dragging them further out to sea. To make matters worse, they had only one paddle between the 3 of them. So, not exactly a solid plan. Eventually, they decided to use a flare. My dad, who had served in the Coast Guard, had cleaned up an old commercial life raft for larger ships and brought some gear home with him, including a flare. He pulled it out, fired it into the sky, and for the first minute or two, nothing happened. They assumed it was expired. Then, boom, the entire sky lit up with an orange glow. They watched in awe as Coast Guard boats appeared from all directions. Helicopters followed, the whole 9 yards. When the rescuers pulled alongside, most of them knew my dad and started shouting, "Where's the ship? Where did your boat sink? How many people are missing?" It took a moment to explain. No ship, no missing people, just 3 guys stranded in a tiny dinghy with a runaway flare. Turns out they'd accidentally fired a commercial-grade rescue flare, the kind cruise lines keep for emergencies, way more expensive than the dinghy they were in. The flare could be seen for at least 60 miles, and the Coast Guard assumed it might be a missile, a plane going down, or some other serious emergency. They got towed back to shore for free and had a story they'd be laughing about for years. Moral of the story: the flares you buy at Harbor Freight are not the same as what a cruise ship keeps in its emergency life raft. I was on a NOAA charting mission in the Gulf of Mexico when Hurricane Katrina hit. We stayed offshore near Galveston while the storm battered Louisiana, then eventually made our way to the mouth of the Mississippi River. Our survey ship's new assignment was to check for any sunken vessels blocking the river channel, anything that could shut it down. At night, we held station just outside the river's mouth. Over the first few days, hundreds of cargo ships started showing up, vessels that would normally have steamed straight up the Mississippi to handle their business. All of them were calling for pilots to guide them upriver, but there was no response. From offshore, it looked like a city of ships glowing on the water, while the actual shore was pitch black. The contrast was surreal, almost post-apocalyptic. Over the course of a week, the ships gradually moved on, rerouted to other ports so they could unload their cargo. It was one of those moments where you realize the scale of human industry and how quickly nature can turn everything upside down. We were heading out to our usual spot at the end of the jetties when we noticed something horrifying. The entire visible sea around us was covered with dead Gulf menhaden. For several square miles, the surface was a slick of rotting fish. Even though I normally have a strong stomach, I couldn't help but throw up. We called the local Parks and Wildlife hotline, and their response was almost casual. "Yeah, that happens sometimes." Heavy rains wash pollution down the Mississippi. You probably shouldn't eat any of it. It was, without a doubt, the weirdest, nastiest, and saddest thing I've ever seen at sea. An entire section of the ocean made unrecognizable by death and decay. I'm an ex-Navy sailor, served on a Spruance-class destroyer, and I've got a few hair-raising experiences at sea. First was a rudder sticking during an underway replenishment, which led to a near collision with a tanker. Not exactly your average day at work. Second, our CO decided to cut across the bow of not one, but two aircraft carriers, almost causing a carrier-destroyer collision. Spoiler, destroyers don't come out on top in that scenario. Third, we tried outrunning a hurricane in the South China Sea. The ship was rolling 35 degrees, waves taller than 35 feet were crashing over the bridge, and it felt like we were living inside a perfect storm. That one really sticks with you. I've got a story about something really strange I saw at sea. In the middle of the day, out on deck, a dark disc-like object suddenly appeared hovering above the water. 1 second the sky was clear, and the next, there it was. No approach, no sound, nothing, just this black shape seemingly materializing out of nowhere. A few of us started shouting, "What is that? Look at that! Do you see that?" while it hovered for maybe 30 seconds. Then, faster than we could even track, it shot straight into the water. There was a huge splash, and it vanished. A minute later, two FA/18 Super Hornets roared past, flying directly over the exact spot where the object had hovered. The jets seemed to react instantly, pulling up sharply as if something had just happened below them. The object itself, no noise, no visible propulsion, just a black disc, left this weird, unexplainable feeling. We all just stared at the water for a while, trying to process what we'd seen. No one knew what to do. We didn't report it because, honestly, who do you tell when the US military isn't interested in UFOs? One guy managed to capture it on video, and the footage even caught the fighter jets fly past after the object hit the water. So when people say, if UFOs were real, someone would have filmed them, I can tell them, we did. I still don't know what it was, but seeing something move that fast and disappear like that completely changed the way I think about UFOs. If they can move faster than our eyes can follow, it makes a lot more sense why they're so hard to track. I'm an open water kayaker, and one weekend I took a trip to Charleston, South Carolina, planning to paddle around the harbor and barrier islands. There's an inlet between Isle of Palms and Sullivan's Island called Breach's Inlet. It's notorious for deadly, unpredictable rip currents, but that seemed like the perfect place to play. The currents here are complicated. The flow out of Charleston Harbor, the general coastline current, and the current streaming out of the inlet all collide, creating some wild, fun waves. I was in a used Neki Elaho HV I'd recently bought from a closing kayak shop's rental fleet. At 17.5 feet, it's surprisingly nimble and fun, but I'd only paddled it in flat inland lakes and calm rivers. No breaking waves, no real surf. Out here, though, waves were crashing over me from multiple directions, 6 to 8 feet high at times. The boat had a hidden problem I didn't know about. Both the bow and stern have watertight compartments for flotation, covered with neoprene hatches reinforced with a plastic cover. What I didn't realize was that the bead on the rear hatch had broken. Visually, it looked fine, but it could barely hold. In flat water, it didn't matter, but here, with waves regularly breaking over the deck, that flaw became catastrophic. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just a little sluggishness in steering, which I blamed on fatigue. Then I realized I was riding lower in the water. Each wave seemed to push me off course, and soon the rear deck was almost entirely awash. The boat wasn't floating above the waves anymore, I was in them. Hundreds of pounds of water had flooded the rear compartment, making the kayak sluggish, tippy, and almost uncontrollable. 3/4 of a mile offshore, surrounded by 6 to 8 foot waves coming from every direction, I was genuinely scared. Every stroke toward shore required 3 or 4 corrections just to keep from being pushed off course. I had to brace constantly to avoid capsizing, and progress was painfully slow. What should have been a 5 to 10 minute paddle took over an hour. The last 50 meters were helped by a passing boat. By the time I reached shore, a small crowd had gathered, and help arrived shortly after. My VHF radio had been useless. I couldn't let go of the paddle long enough to use it in the thick of it. When I finally landed, the kayak was angled about 30 degrees forward. The rear compartment was fully flooded, leaving only the bow compartment providing flotation. I didn't paddle that kayak again until the rear hatch cover was properly replaced. Before I joined the U.S. Navy, my grandfather pulled me aside and shared stories from his time in World War II. It was his way of making sure I understood what I might face. He served as a weapons technician too, WT2, aboard the destroyer USS Maury-DD 401 from 1942 to 1945, manning a 5-inch/38 caliber cannon. He survived Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Tarawa, the Battle of Midway, and the invasion of Luzon, with just a small shrapnel wound to his leg. One story in particular has stayed with me my entire life. Date: August 21st, 1943. Location: WSW of Nindo Island, Solomon Islands. Ship: USS Maury-DD 401. The Maury was escorting an HMES Australian vessel to Espiritu Santo. Japanese forces were still active in the region, and Allied forces were working to secure Guadalcanal and the surrounding islands. It was a calm, clear night. The stars sparkled overhead. The wind was nearly non-existent, and the gentle splash of the wakes against the hulls mixed with the distant calls of fishing gulls. The kind of night that made you want to just stand on deck and bask in the moonlight. Then, radio chatter from nearby Allied bases cut through the quiet, reports of potential enemy submarines to the north. Orders went out immediately, and the crew was called to battle stations. A small patrol team scanned the waters, but after a couple of hours, no contacts were made, and the crew was finally allowed to stand down. Before daybreak, more warnings came in. Unidentified aircraft flying just 5 miles south of the escort position. Now, in addition to the threat of submarines, they had to prepare for a possible aerial assault. Engines were cut, emergency lights activated, and all shipboard lights were ordered extinguished. My grandfather, manning a searchlight, was told, "Put that candle out," so he aimed the beam straight into the water. For 45 minutes, the Maury drifted silently, the low hum of aircraft passing just above the water their only sound. The crew held their breath, hoping to remain unseen. Eventually, the planes moved on, and after nearly 2 hours of tense waiting, the order came to start engines and resume passage. It was then that my grandfather saw something that would haunt him for decades. As he flicked his cigarette overboard and switched his searchlight back on, still pointing into the water, he saw an eyeball the size of a basketball staring straight at him from 10 feet below the surface. Time seemed to freeze. The silvery disk of the eye looked through him for what felt like minutes. Then, with a sudden, terrifying burst, the creature broke the surface for a moment before diving deep. This was long before giant squid had ever been caught on camera, before most people even believed they existed. Yet my grandfather knew what he had seen, and it left a mark on him and the 2 other men with him. In my own Navy career, I heard countless stories of strange encounters at sea, even collected a few teeth pulled from a ship's rubber liner, but I never saw anything like that firsthand. The combination of war, the unknown, and a creature of such size and intelligence would terrify anyone. My grandfather is now 93, still alive, though dementia sometimes blurs the lines of past and present. Even so, it's comforting to know that some heroes, men who faced unimaginable challenges, still walk among us. I saw a comment on this before that was wild. One night, a guy who had rowed across the Pacific said that enormous eels, thick as forearms, with glowing eyes, suddenly started swimming around his boat. Then, all at once, they lifted their heads straight out of the water, like periscopes, and turned to watch him. He said he could never tell if it had actually happened or if it was some hallucination from exhaustion. A few years ago, we were racing offshore in a 40-foot sailboat. I was on the foredeck, and the wind was screaming. As we rounded a mark to start running downwind, I somehow managed to tangle the spinnaker halyard. Keep in mind, I hadn't slept more than an hour or so over the last 48 hours. Being the junior crew member and the one who caused the mess, I got sent up the mast. I'd climbed it plenty of times before, but never in conditions like this. I was soaking wet, in full gear, with waves pounding the hull and the wind roaring past. The boat was surfing at 4 knots, and every motion felt magnified tenfold at the top of a 40-foot mast. I clung for dear life. Sure, I was secured to a halyard, but I could vividly imagine losing my grip and being flung around like a marionette. It was terrifying, exhausting, and absolutely exhilarating, all at once. Definitely one of those moments I'll never forget. No one will probably see this, but I was a sailor in the US Navy. We were out in the middle of the ocean on the carrier, heading down from Northland, almost home. My job was comms, satellite comms, so even though I was lower rank, I had my own radio. My friend Lane and I were out in the smoke pit, taking a few drags before muster, when something incredible happened at sunset. For a brief moment, the sky lit up green. It was breathtaking, like nothing I could ever describe, with the dark ocean stretching endlessly beneath it. And then, both our radios went off at the same time. I checked around, and all my SATCOM gear was down. All his HF gear was dead. Anything with an antenna had stopped working. Even the satellite antennas lost tracking. For about 20 minutes, everything was completely offline. I still have no idea what caused it. For an entire carrier to lose all comms at once, it had to be something extraordinary. Got here a bit late, but I've got a couple of stories. We were sailing in the Bahamas and ended up having to navigate through a line of waterspouts. They were small, but even small waterspouts can really mess things up. I read this one in a boating magazine, so the details are a little hazy. It was about communication, or the lack of it, between cruising couples. In this story, the husband gave his wife some coordinates to sail to when she came on watch, then went below to sleep. As she sailed along, the water around the boat suddenly started boiling. Panicking, she screamed for her husband. He came up on deck, looked around calmly, and said, "Oh, we're here." It turned out he had set their course straight for a submerged active volcano. Sweet, a sailor thread. I was in the Coast Guard for 6 years. 2 quick stories. First, whenever we dumped waste overboard through the grinder/piping system, dolphins would jump in and out of it, face first, until the process was done. Completely ridiculous, but kind of hilarious. Second story, way scarier. I was on watch on the bridge when the sea suddenly seemed to come alive for as far as I could see, maybe 180 degrees around the boat, stretching out about 8 miles. It was visible to the naked eye, and through binoculars, it was terrifying. I was the only one on the bridge. The other crew member was doing rounds inside the cutter, so I completely freaked out, like full-blown panic mode. I ran down and woke the skipper, who joined me on the bridge. It was just after dawn off San Diego, small crew, everyone nursing hangovers, so it was just the 2 of us. The boiling water was getting closer, and we were so confused and scared that we froze. Like you want to scream, but don't want to look crazy if it turns out to be nothing. About 5 minutes into the chaos, the other crew member returned and joined us in our confusion. Finally, the skipper looked through the binos and said, "Oh, they're dolphins." Sure enough, the vessel was surrounded by dolphins, so many that the water seemed alive for 8 miles all around. It lasted about 30 minutes before they all migrated off. Absolutely beautiful, but also terrifying. Before we realized what it was, it genuinely scared the hell out of me. I was crewing on a boat during the 2012 Newport Ensenada race, and we were the first to come across and report the wreckage of this boat, including 2 of the sailors who had been aboard. It was a beautiful morning, and we were cruising along at about 6 knots when suddenly we saw debris scattered across the water. We had just crossed into Mexican waters, so we weren't sure what we were looking at, until one of the crew up front shouted, "Hey, is that a dead guy?" Sure enough, it was a shirtless body floating face down among a lot of debris spread over a large area. Eventually, we spotted another body, but there was nothing to clearly indicate what kind of boat it had come from. We didn't really know what to think at first. My immediate thought was some kind of drug deal gone wrong, but the captain decided to radio it in and keep going, leaving it to the authorities. Within 5 minutes, a Coast Guard helicopter was on the scene. Later, we learned more details. At first, people assumed the boat had collided with a cargo ship running without lights in the dark, but eventually it became clear that the crew had likely run aground on an island in the early morning, and the boat had broken apart on the rocks. All 4 crew members were presumed dead, though I believe only 3 of the bodies were ever recovered.